Welcome to Vanguard, a heretical podcast on culture, society, and politics. Here are your hosts, Colin Liddell, Andy Nowicki, and Richard Spencer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vanguard. This is Richard Spencer, and this is being recorded on Saturday, December 8th, 2012, and it will be released to the world on the following Sunday, December 9th. With me, as usual, are Colin Liddell, who joins us from the Far East, and Andy Nowicki.
And from the future as well, one day ahead of you.
From the Far East and from the future. And Andy Nowicki, who he's actually 20 years behind, and he's in down south.
2 hours behind you.
Right. Yeah, but decades in reality.
Yeah.
Down in Savannah, Georgia country. So anyway, Andy, how are things down in Georgia?
Well, I'm actually in Jacksonville right now, Florida. I'm going to see the lowly Jacksonville Jaguars battle the mediocre New York Jets tomorrow.
Wow, that will be
maybe
an
for
exercise
a sighting of the second coming. That is Tim Tebow. Got my fingers crossed.
That I was joking about this before we got on the air. It's funny, there are these two web phenomena that have developed over the last dozen years. One of them is blogging, of course, and the other is podcasting. Blogging is obviously a lot more.
I just like to say that some people do get them mixed up, though. I think your point was that the blogs are quite short and to the point, and then podcasts are long and rambling. It's very hard to get a podcast like a blog, but it's quite easy to get a blog like a podcast.
Yeah, well, let's back up.
These very, very elongated essays.
Which you've written about, Colin.
That's right, very much on my mind, yeah.
The latest essay at Alternative Right.
Yeah,
it just seems to be a bit of a trend. A lot of the things I've found on the internet recently seem to be going in that direction. I think people kind of feel that the long word count adds a certain gravitas to the content of what they're saying, whatever that content may or may not be.
It's the lack of editors.
Well, it's a lot of people have sort of come to writing on the internet, and they haven't actually had a background in paper journalism, and so word counts have become kind of meaningless. But I mean, ideally, a blog should be quite short and to the point, shouldn't it?
Well, right. Well, let's back up. I mean, what I was about to say is that there are two phenomenon: the blog and the podcast. The blog, for better and for worse, has inspired short one-liners or snarky one-liners and a link. And people think that's writing, and that's further inspired the tweet. These things aren't, of course, bad in themselves, but I think we have closed our minds, collectively. But the podcast, inversely, has inspired people to ramble for hours and post it.
That's what we're doing now.
And that's what people like to hear too. Yeah.
But I don't think
we're giving them what they want.
That's not bad. That's not bad, also, because I think sometimes a lot of interesting ideas will emerge from the conversation. And those aren't allowed to emerge when you have these we're coming up against an advertising break, but give me a 2-sentence answer to this meaning of life, kind of thing. So I think the podcast is a really interesting forum. I mean, I love podcasts. I cut the cables, man. I don't listen to cable news. I don't have cable at all. I get most of my stuff online, but I really like podcasts as a substitute for radio. Just smarter people. None of those kind of, gross radio personalities. But Colin, you were kind of saying in terms of to go back to your second point about people having what is that funny word? It's like verbal diarrhea, logorrhea. And I think that's true. And a lot of it is because they've never been given a task like write an 800-word column or a 1,600-word book review or something. And maybe that is restrictive at some level, but it's also a good exercise in a way. And I think also there's just there's maybe the lack of editing and just this idea that we really have, you have an editor and you really want to craft a piece. You want to go back, send it back to the author and so on and so forth. It's kind of,
editing is actually a very right-wing process, isn't it?
Yes, it's censorious.
It's anti-authentic, man, to edit. Just want to get it out. And
I mean, all sentences are surely equal,
I agree. I mean, it's my, because I've been kind of living in the blog world for a while. I did work at the American Conservative for a little while, and there I remember doing some things. I wasn't given, of course, macro editorial duties. That was Scott McConnell and so on and so forth. But I did do some things like edit a 2,200 word piece down to a 1,600 word piece, and just that process of really finding the things that were most meaningful, and I thought those were in some ways good exercises. But yeah. I know also as an editor, like when I worked at Talkie Mag and stuff like that, there is just this pressure to get stuff out. I mean, if you look at these places like the Huffington Post or TechCrunch or whatever. I mean, these guys are they're publishing 50 to 100 pieces a day. And there's just this.
That's one thing I like about alt-right, that sometimes for a few days it just goes kind of quiet.
Yeah, we're thinking.
That's it. Yeah, we don't have to say anything. We know.
Well, our silence says it all.
Not happening. So what's the
exactly.
comment on?
Why write about them if they're not happening?
Whereas the places you're talking about, Richard, and I've noticed this this is a cliche kind of, but with cable news, of course, 24-hour news cycle where it's like, okay, well, what are we going to talk about today? Something's got to be an issue. Let's make this an issue. And so they try to dredge up something and make it news.
Well, you know what they're actually doing? It's even worse, because what they're doing is actually looking at Google search trends. And I really am not, I'm not making this up. They go and they look at Google search trends, and then they'll hire a journalist to write a piece. So if for some weird, for some weird reason, there's some weird trend towards like looking up guitars made in France, they'll send a journalist and he'll be like, guitars made in France, like the fad sweeping the country. Like, what's it all about? I have no idea.
So the whole idea that if you want to be in the news, just be trending on Google or in some other search engine, and then they'll come up with a story about what you're talking about.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's a weird. It's something weird, and I think that's I know CNN does that kind of. I think actually explicitly for a while they. As just a way to dredge up news. I also noticed some of these. I'll look at blogs. I should write a piece on this actually, because I really, over the past year, I've started to read a lot more tech blogs, and I think the reason why I read them is because it's like the only people in my life who are kind of happy. It's like when you read the alternative right writ large, it's like the civilization's ending and white race is doomed. And it seems like, at least technology-wise, I'm interested in it anyway, but it's kind of like, wow, there's this cool thing. Like, we're moving forward, everyone. It's like the only positive bright light. But I to go back to that, I noticed with them, because there are a ton of them that are pretty much indistinguishable and interchangeable. And, one of them will write something, and then 5 minutes later, it's like the other one have, and they'll, it's like they're all kind of keeping up with each other to just post, basically, as much as possible. But anyway, what were we going to talk about? I think we were going to talk about Japanese politics.
Japanese politics.
And it's trending right now, so we're just going to talk about it. We know nothing about the subject.
That's a shock.
Yeah. Japanese politics.
It's not even trending over here, in a way. Most of the Japanese people don't seem to be too moved by Japanese politics.
But anyway, we're going to
why should they be? Because it has much less relevance to their lives than it does elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. This is all true. One thing, we're going to talk about Japanese politics, and then we're going to actually talk about the idea of reactionary conservatism. And we're actually going to bring up an article in Radix by Elizabeth Wright, and it was her critique of Glenn Beck and this kind of stuff. So I think this will be an interesting discussion. But first off, Colin, why don't you tell us? I think a lot of our listeners probably need to know the lay of the land in terms of what exactly is going on in Japanese politics, just objectively. You guys have an election in the next couple of weeks.
Like in America and Britain, Japan for a time was moving from a kind of one-party system, which was the Liberal Democratic Party, kind of basically dominating everything, to a two-party system where you had the Democratic Party of Japan supposedly fulfilling the same role as the Democratic Party in America, and the Liberal Democratic Party fulfilling the same role as the Republican Party. But there are lots of very, very basic differences. The Japanese like to try to copy the West, but at the same time, they're also radically different from the West. So that when they try to copy the West, it doesn't quite work out in the way that they probably expected. And so what you have now, you have these two major, so-called major parties, and in the latest opinion poll that I have, which is December the 6th, they get about 27 or 28% of voter support. So you have the Liberal Democratic Party, which has about 18.4% in the opinion poll, and then the Democratic Party of Japan has 9.3%. So this is quite a contrast from the American election, where you had Republicans and the Democrats almost tied in the late 40s. So this obviously means that there's an enormous gap for other parties to sort of emerge into. And so there's been quite a lot of that, but also there's been a massive amount of apathy as well. This election is sort of taking place in a kind of apathy vacuum. And the most obvious signs of the election are posters going up and people with megaphones in front of railway stations every morning.
And what are they saying?
I wish I knew, actually, but I had an interesting experience the other morning at the railway station, which is this seems to be the kind of political fulcrum in Japan. Is in front of the railway station for about the 30 seconds to a minute that it takes you to sort of get out of earshot. And there was a sort of sound truck from the Mina no To, which translates as everybody's party. And the official English name, however, is Your Party. So you see, there's a kind of difference in translation. The literal Japanese meaning is everybody's party, which kind of emphasizes a kind of collective identity. But when it's translated into official English, it becomes Your Party, which is much more kind of individualist. So this reflects a difference in culture and outlook, I think. But Mina no To, they had staff members out there in front of the station giving leaflets to all the voters, because it's everybody's party. But of course, when the foreigner approached, that's a different story. I'm not part of everybody.
Gaijin, where are you? Is it Gaijin? Is that how they say it?
I'm a Gaijin, yeah. So of course they know I can't vote, but of course, as a Gaijin in Japan, I do have lots of influence, because most Gaijin do work in education in some form or other, as do I. So, but anyway, they're not interested in extending the concept of everybody to the foreigner, which is obviously, I could take that the wrong way, or I could be broad-minded about it.
Take it the right way. Isn't Gaijin, isn't like the origin of that word? Like,
well, the thing is, I can't actually vote in Britain either. So, I'm actually one of the disenfranchised of the world, strangely enough.
Well, so you're no longer a citizen of Britain?
Well, I am a citizen, but I've been out of the country too long without being registered as a voter. And I think this is because of some of the rules that the Labour Party brought in while they were in power to kind of disenfranchise expats. Because most expats tended to be better off, and therefore they tended to vote for the enemy of the Labour Party.
Interesting. But then could you become a citizen of Japan, Colin? I mean, we obviously know there's a xenophobia in Japan, and I of course mean that as a great compliment. But
some people do, some foreign people do, but I have no wish to become a citizen of a country of which I am not a kind of organic part.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy to be Scottish, and that at the moment means British.
For the moment, yeah.
Yeah. And so who knows, forever? Who knows?
Right.
Colin, what does the Everybody's Party stand for? How do they appeal to everybody? Or how do they ostensibly appeal to everybody?
Well, they're an offshoot of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is, in American terms, the Republican Party, or in British terms, the Conservative Party, roughly, very, very roughly. But of course, that's extremely roughly, because I don't really think it's fair to compare even the Japanese Communist Party with the Republican Party. The Republican Party in America is more left-wing than the Japanese Communist Party.
That doesn't surprise me.
Well, so you're not really sure what what their platform is or anything along those lines?
Well, they're sort of described as neoliberalism, and so that probably means they want to sort of mimic America more than other parties. So they're kind of more in favor of individualism and low tax. That's their image of America, and you sort of break in this kind of Japanese support economy where you allow companies to collapse if they're not good enough, and so they're probably slightly more in favor of that. But usually Japanese political parties are basically personal feudal sects connected to individual politicians. And the theory comes later. So it's like, politician A had a row with politicians B and C, and so he left party X, and then he made party Y. That's the sort of basic equation. And then according
the personal is the political.
The personal is the political. And then they think, okay, where's my power base? How should I market it? And what sort of policies should I then suck in to sort of cover myself with? So that's how that works. I mean, a very noticeable case of that is one of the legends of the Japanese political scene, which is Ichiro Ozawa. Back when he started in politics, it must have been about in the 1970s. I think he was about the 1970s. So he's been in politics for like 40, 50 years. And when he started off, the only game in town was the Liberal Democratic Party. So naturally, he was part of the Liberal Democratic Party. He was all wrapped up in the corruption. And in the 90s, the Liberal Democratic Party got into trouble, and it started to fragment in various ways. There was lots of infighting. There were lots of problems with corruption and so on. And then he made a minor party based around his personal support network. And all those kind of minor parties started to kind of gradually coalesce, and then they created the Democratic Party of Japan, which is now the governing party. They had a major breakthrough back in the 2009 election. And so the Democratic Party of Japan was supposed to take the role of the Democratic Party in America. So, to sort of complement the Liberal Democratic Party's Republican Party Act. And so he sort of became a part of the DPJ. But another point that I should emphasize is that because of this this sort of feudal system where individual politicians have a lot of power in their parties, this sort of generates a lot of corruption and sort of dubious fundraising activities. And so Ozawa is a kind of master at that. He knows how to get his hands on the money. And so because of that is the kind of essence of his power, not any political principle, but because he's a kind of power broker and he's a kind of shadow shogun figure. And so because of the kind of dubious methods he uses to sort of raise money, he got involved in various political scandals. But his party, which was trying to have a kind of morally acceptable image to the voter, they wouldn't support him enough. So he argued with the other people in the DPJ, and then finally he decided to break away again. And that's probably one of the main reasons why we're having the election now, after 3 years after the last general election.
Well, just out of curiosity, I mean, is the Japanese political system in a static state, much like in the United States, where, at least from our perspective, it seems like nothing much of importance changes with these elections? I mean, do you think Japan is in essentially a holding pattern? And is there any kind of political party that would do something as bold as kick the United States military bases off their island, Okinawa, and so on and so forth,
Well, yeah, that's. I mean, there seems to be a lot happening. If you look at it in strictly party terms, it's like, wow, there's so much going on.
Yeah.
But if you look at it in what actually changes and what gets done, then I'd say roughly Japan is in pretty much of a holding pattern, and the civil service is basically, that's where the real continuity is. And it is possible that a kind of political force could be generated that could sort of upset that status quo. Mm-hmm. It has to kick in American bases out. That would really require a real turnaround. But there is little glimmers of that from time to time.
Would it be the far right or the far left who would be, or both, who would be really pushing for something like that in Japanese politics?
In a way, yeah. It's see, in Japan, you have the so-called far right, and these are people who sort of kind of dress up as kind of weekend warriors in camouflage gear, and they have these big sound trucks painted with nationalistic symbols, and they play all these...
Mishima Wannabes.
That's right, yeah. You have those kind of guys. A lot of those guys were originally subsidized by the CIA, and in a way, I think their role in Japanese politics is to give overt nationalism a bad name. And that kind of, because you have this very, very visible, obnoxious image associated with Japanese nationalism. And of course, the sort of very natural effect on the average Japanese voter is, fucking hell, nationalism really sucks and it's uncool and it's shit. You know what I mean? So it turns a lot of people off overt nationalism. Recently, the Chinese have been dabbling in Japanese politics. They've been very provocative to Japan. And I sometimes think that's to sort of break Japan of that habit of seeing nationalism in a very negative light.
So the Chinese are pro-nationalism, you think?
My suspicion, and I can't prove it, of course, but my suspicion is the Chinese want to provoke Japanese nationalism because they think in the long term they will benefit from that.
Interesting. As what? As a countervailing force of the United States? Or?
Well, see, if the people in Japan, the ordinary kind of average voters, become more nationalistic and they start to veer towards more kind of overtly nationalist politics, the unescapable logic of that is that Japan would then have to have like its own nuclear deterrent. And then the question then arises, why does Japan need to have these bases with Americans who the local communities are really quite strongly against?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
And often this is related to incidents of rape and things like that, which are unavoidable in the long term, you see. Especially in places like Okinawa, there's been several well-documented cases of people from U.S. bases raping girls, sometimes underage girls. So things like that, the fact that Japan still has U.S. bases, what was it now, 67 years after the war and 23 years after the end of the Cold War and so on, that's obviously a kind of contradiction. And so there has to be a reason for those bases to be there. And so if Japan sort of did actually decide to be more nationalistic and to have its own nuclear deterrent, it wouldn't really need the American bases. And so they would have to go. And that would be something which would greatly benefit the Chinese, because the Japanese would therefore no longer be a proxy for the United States.
Yeah.
And they would then realize that their economic interests coalesce to a very large degree with China's, and also further north to Russia's, and they would make the pragmatic decisions to accommodate themselves to that situation, and that would basically kick the Americans well out of the Western Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty fascinating because it's like a big bundle of contradictions, because from I'm speaking obviously from an outsider's perspective, but at least the reports I've read is there's strong anti-Japanese feeling amongst Chinese. And that stretched back to the Second World War, and actually what happened before the Second World War proper. And that's a very strong cultural antipathy. But then obviously they're becoming more and more economically bound up. And also the other contradiction is, of course, is that in the United States you have both a lot of these hawkish types and neocons are very anti-China, almost even bellicose. And I'm sure the Chinese are aware of that. They're no dummies. And they're pretty skeptical. But then you have this very weird arrangement of Chimerica, which has been going on for, say around 2 decades, of essentially things being designed in the United States, manufactured in China, and then sold to Americans who need credit, which they get from the Chinese. It's this weird, like, loop, merry-go-round that just keeps going round and round.
Yeah,
and,
but
that's why Red Dawn was re-edited. The movie we talked about
because it's kind of like
re-edited to make the North Koreans the villains.
Yeah, it's like the Hawks.
The Chinese.
Yeah, I mean the Hawks like that, and a lot of the conservative movement likes all that anti-China talk. But then,
with Chimerica, the Chi part of Chimerica is pretty hard to replace, but the America part of Chimerica is actually quite easy to replace. I mean, you could have like a Chiroper, couldn't you?
Yeah, that's true.
All the America part of Chimerica is this sort of like is the Federal Reserve pumping all this Mickey Mouse money.
Yeah, right. I mean, also the consumers. I mean, the China seems to, they don't want their currency to appreciate vis-a-vis the dollar, and so they are kind of. I mean, I don't even like accusing China of manipulating the currency. I think that's stupid when all these Americans say that, because Federal Reserve Bank is like the biggest currency manipulator of all time. But anyway, they basically want the dollar to appreciate vis-a-vis the yuan, the renminbi, so that essentially the American consumer has that purchasing power to buy goods from China. But they don't want the Chinese to buy the goods. Obviously, if they allowed their own currency to appreciate, then their own citizens would have a greater ability to buy their own goods that they produce. It's just kind of a very strange situation. And I don't know. I mean, they obviously are benefiting, and I guess they get to kind of have hyper industrialization with this weird arrangement. And you can see some really interesting things. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of these ghost cities in China, but they've I think there's a lot of excess capital, excess savings needs to go somewhere, and they've built massive cities that have no one living in them. They're kind of just waiting there. In a way, it's a way.
They've also built a massive city in Angola. I saw something on the internet about that with pictures, and they built this massive place with all these kind of high-rise apartment blocks in the middle of Angola.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it's going to end up because they seem to be in this, dance where China's sitting on a great deal of treasury bills. It's still buying bonds. America seems determined to devalue the dollar. And you have a lot of other people, Barack Obama and stuff like talking about, we'll devalue the dollar and more stuff made in America, we'll sell it to the world. So you have all these countervailing forces, and I don't know what is going to happen. But
the Chinese are getting the factories, and America is getting the shopping malls, right? So when it comes to the final conflict, who's going to win, I wonder?
Well, the shopping malls, of course. the shopping malls and credit cards.
Colin, something I was wondering about, that's sort of tangentially related to Japanese politics. We talk a lot about the guilty white man and white ethnomasochism, and constantly flagellating the white Western man, constantly flagellating himself or being encouraged to think of himself, his history as uniquely evil and his ancestors as having committed all these atrocities and so forth. But I was wondering in Japan, with the things that were done, when you were talking about Japan and China and their relationship, it made me think of, the atrocities that were committed by Japanese soldiers in Japan, the rape of Nanking and other things like that. Does anyone ever try to play the, you guys have such a guilty past, and, does anybody play that card, and does it work on the Japanese, or are they just, my suspicion is that it's not.
Yeah.
That doesn't really work on anybody but white people. But I was curious if you're there.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that, but usually, there's certain kind of like left-wing people who sometimes try to cultivate that kind of atmosphere. There's certain films or documentaries made about atrocities and crimes and comfort women and the Nanking massacre. But it's very marginal. That's the main point, I think. Rather than sort of look at it in any great detail, I'd have to say that is very, very marginal. And so there are instances you can cite where Japanese people have sort of apologized for what happened in the past and made little documentaries about it, but it hasn't really sort of soaked into the wider culture.
There's actually a book, I believe the author's name's Shivelbush, called The Culture of Defeat, and he talks about, I think he talks about the South after the Civil War. He talks about Germany after World War I, and he also talks about Japan after the Second World War. And so it was a kind of culture that did, I hesitate to say this, embrace defeat in a way.
Well, we're actually we're sort of almost talking on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, aren't we?
Yes.
And that's something that tends to get skipped over here in Japan, obviously. Nanking Massacre gets pretty much skipped over. But the atomic bombing of Hiroshima is always, big news. So,
and I suspect that here it would be the very reverse. Well, I guess we still talk about 9/11 and stuff, but I mean, you do hear much more. It seems like the volume is turned up much more when it's the terrible things that the white West has done in general, and that that white America of the past has done in particular.
But it's complicated because obviously you get that what you're talking about if you go through any kind of schooling in America. But I think at the same time, and certainly Western Europe, but there's a kind of asymmetry between America and Western Europe, because in Western Europe, the Second World War is at best looked at as a tragic, unnecessary conflagration, and at worst, we're all Nazis and so on and so forth. The Holocaust, Auschwitz, blah blah blah. But in America, the Second World War, that's kind of the only time that Americans are encouraged. Well, there's some other times, but that's one of the central times that Americans are really encouraged to think of themselves as having this Homeric, heroic history. Yeah. But the only way that they're allowed that is that it was liberating and for equality. You wouldn't. There's not a sense
Ken
of
Burns.
Ken Burns style.
Can't stand Ken Burns.
Yes, a saccharine liberalism, basically. And so they're kind of, it's like Americans are allowed a heroic past so long as it's on behalf of equality. But it's kind of interesting. Right. It's kind of like the Germans, like you don't even have a equalitarian heroic past. Like it's all bad kind of thing.
Right.
One of the things in Japan is instead of criticizing Imperial Japan for various war crimes and excesses, there's a very strong movement that actually sees Japanese imperialism has a kind of liberating force. And if you look at the effect that the Japanese aggression had, it actually helped to decolonialize much of Asia. Oh, and this is one of the so-called positives that they then try to emphasize as a kind of redeeming quality of Japanese imperialism. So in Tokyo, the main shrine, which is dedicated to people who died for the emperor, including certain so-called official war criminals, is Yasukuni Jinja. And so next to Yasukuni Jinja, there is a museum, and this presents this view of the war, this very kind of positive, moral kind of version of almost politically correct Japanese imperialism, going to Asia, kicking out the kind of evil, exploitative British, Dutch, the white man from places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on.
That's fascinating.
So they're kind of trying to frame things in our morality as well, so which is kind of interesting. But underlying that, it's their own morality, or from Western perspective, maybe lack of morality that's calling the shots.
Yeah. Well, I think, don't you think that the white guilt on a fundamental level is a Christian heresy?
Sorry, what's that? The white guilt?
White guilt is a Christian heresy in its most fundamental level. And what I mean by that is that's why it's effective. Because it's not, if you go to someone and say, oh, you suck, you're ugly, your parents were evil, blah, blah, they probably have a natural tendency to say like, whoa, hey, hold on, like only I get to criticize my family, kind of one of these. But the only reason why white guilt is effective is because it's this morally pregnant kind of, it's like, I am guilty, I need to transcend my past, kind of thing. That's why it's so effective, because it calls upon a kind of heretical Christianity, or kind of like Christianity without Christ, and that's why it's effective. I mean, don't you? And in some ways, the Christianity did not, though it converted much in most of Europe, the Japanese they've embraced Christmas as a kind of shocking holiday. They haven't.
Well, Christmas is a major shagging festival over here.
Shagging festival.
The point you're making about Christianity is obviously. Very true. I mean, we Europeans, Westerners, are post-Christian, and which just basically means Christianity with the Christ knocked out.
Yeah.
And so, we do have this kind of capacity for feeling bad about ourselves and sort of beating ourselves up. And in Japan, the kind of cultural references is things like Shintoism and Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And there, the emphasis is very different. So, for example, Japan gets into a lot of trouble because of Yasukuni Jinja, and occasionally certain prominent politicians go to Yasukuni Jinja and they show their respect for the spirits of the dead, which also include people like Hideki Tojo and various other so-called war criminals. And so the Chinese pretend to get very angry about that, and a lot of people in the West think that Japan is obviously doing itself a disfavor by allowing politicians to do that. But for the Japanese, the key point is not to feel guilty and to beat yourself up, but to placate the spirits of the dead.
Interesting.
So, for example, several years ago, there was a case of the Korean noses. And this goes back to the 16th century. Back in the 16th century, the late 16th century, the Japanese decided to invade Korea. And they fought a couple of very bloody wars there. And this involved various forms of atrocity, including killing lots of Korean people. And there was a kind of bounty system in effect, which meant that the people doing the killing had to have some sort of means of showing how many Koreans they had killed. Mm-hmm. And the way they managed to do this, instead of scalping them like happened in North America, they cut off the nosies and brought the nosies back to show how many Koreans they'd killed. Oh. And all these nosies were taken over to Japan. And so the Japanese, because they had all these Korean nosies, instead of feeling guilty about all the Koreans they'd killed and all the nosies they'd cut off, they kind of built a shrine to the nosies and showed their respect in that way to the spirits of the dead Koreans. And then I think a few years ago, yes, a few years ago, there was this thing where the nosies were repatriated.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll have to sort of find a link to that or somewhere. Yeah.
I'll find a link to the Shrine of the Noses. Yeah, just writing that down in the show notes.
So yeah, you got to placate the spirits of the dead people you've pissed off by killing, rather than give yourself a hard time.
It really is a very different concept, a different worldview than the Western concept.
Yes, and probably more accurate in many ways.
Yeah, I agree.
This might make a good transition to, not that I want to stop the rambling or anything, but it just occurred to me that the what we were going to talk about from Radix, Elizabeth Wright's excellent, or the late Elizabeth Wright's excellent article about the Tea Party movement, and Glenn Beck really touches on a lot of this stuff.
Definitely, yeah. We should definitely extend the debate to that, and Radix as well.
Yeah, well, I think... let me find a transition. I think one of the transitions was... I
didn't mean to usurp your role as moderator, Richard, but it just occurred to me that there was that linkage there.
Yes, yeah. As moderator, I seem to not just moderate, I seem to try to get my opinion in there. But yeah, I think one interesting thing I was just thinking about is this kind of post-Christian religious significance. And Elizabeth Wright, the article we're referring to is called, what was it called?
The Old Time Religion.
The Old Time Religion, exactly. I think the original article was called Carnival of Repentance, but it's called Old Time Religion. And she actually wrote it in the late summer 2010. And that was probably the peak of the Tea Party movement. And it had probably had the taste of death in its mouth even then. It had peaked. And it had almost become a kind of weird parody of itself, or it's something else. And I remember going to some of these. I remember actually being in New York City in 2009, in the, I guess it was like the early spring or late winter of 2009. And there's this Tea Party movement. No one really knew what it was. I was kind of there as an onlooker, but they filled Lower Manhattan, which is also kind of surprising with all these conservative types. And and I thought it was an interesting thing, and it was actually an organic thing. I mean, whatever you want to say about it, or it's moving, whatever it became, or whatever it supports, it was an organic thing. And it's kind of fascinating. By 2010, it had almost become this weird, ritual, or almost kind of like a religion, and everyone went to Glenn Beck, and they no longer were kind of angry about taxes and, feeling, there was the economic crash, there was the prospect of taxes, there was a black president. So they were no longer angry about that. And instead, they were like worshiping Martin Luther King and Lincoln, some liberal fantasy of Lincoln, and also
aren't these the kind of same people who go to these kind of evangelical meetings anyway?
Well, they are. I mean, the Tea Party was probably because
people might actually agree with the original idea of the Tea Party, but they're not in the habit of going to these kind of open air meetings or whatever, you see. So the only people that are in the habit of going to these open air meetings are these kind of Christian evangelical types. So that would sort of sway the movement in that direction.
It was a Christian revival, and it was, objectively speaking, it was older white people.
Led by a Mormon.
Yeah, led by a Mormon.
Which, make of that what you will.
I don't know what to make of it. I think actually what I would make of it is that all of these American Christian religions have become so gooey that they're all kind of interchangeable. It's like whether you're a Catholic or a Mormon or a Protestant, like you basically believe in America and, liberty and free markets and social security and fighting terrorists and That's kind of like
I think maybe in America you have two types of people on the right. You have people on the right who are not religious, and you have people on the right who are religious. But the people on the right who are religious have the ingrained habit of going to these meetings together and all getting swept up in some sort of kind of hysteria together, and that kind of becomes the dominant force.
I think there's something to that, and anyway, it was quite interesting because they had these big symbols that were on the DC. You had this icons of Lincoln, Martin Luther King, some kind of funny Indian. I remember also I don't even know what this Indian ever did or who he was, but Glenn Beck, he does all this revisionary history where at one point he proved that like blacks won the Revolutionary War, and before it was this weird kind of funny thing that he brought in this person named David Barden, who's some Texas conservative who's trying to rewrite the textbooks. And I remember thinking about it. Oh wow, some Texas conservatives are rewriting the textbooks, and they're kind of conservative. It's probably good. Mm-hmm. But after I saw this man, I was like, good Lord, we should only bring back the Marxists. This guy is totally mendacious. I mean, blacks and whites loved one another in the 18th century, and then there are some evil Southerners who changed that. But then Lincoln saved us, and then he weirdly, unbelievable for a Southerner. He views Reconstruction as this wonderful thing. When it look in South Carolina, we elected all these black representatives. It's like, yes, it's like radical Republicans were trying to destroy the South. They were like rubbing people's faces in it. The idea that you'd look at Reconstruction as this example of colorblindness is beyond absurd. It's like looking at a kangaroo court and talking about Stalin's devotion to justice or something. It's just like ridiculous. Anyway, so I guess what we were trying to get at, and what Elizabeth was getting at, was that you have this civic religion, a kind of old time religion that attracts all these conservatives, and it does kind of push their buttons, like Colin was talking about, in that it is quasi religious, even though it is secular and national at the same time. But the religion at the end of the day is some kind of, I don't know, some kind of Cold War liberalism. It's some kind of liberal fantasy. I mean, at the end of the day, what David Barden and Glenn Beck and so on and so forth are putting forward is the kind of left-wing version of American history that we're all leading to Martin Luther King and greater equality. And this is kind of what the conservatives embrace. And so they are really embracing their own dispossession. They're embracing a sense. I think she had one powerful line. I forget whether this was in that piece in Radix or maybe it was in something else she wrote. But she was talking about all these people like, I'm 100% American. Like, oh, you're not an African American. Like, you're an American. All this kind of stuff. And at some level, that's nationalistic. But at another level, it's kind of a sign of this utter rootlessness. You're not a Franco-American or a Germano-American or an Anglo-American. You don't actually have a history. You're just this kind of you're just kind of a shopper. You like liberty. You vote Republican. You support the wars, kind of thing. There's almost this. It's that whole concept of national identity has been totally hollowed out.
It's a great piece. I was just reading it again today in anticipation of our conversation, and we were talking a little bit about Elizabeth Wright before the show. Mysterious, I guess, enigmatic figure, fascinating character. It sounds like in some ways a black woman.
Yeah.
But who wrote pieces like this, which hopefully everyone listening will buy up a copy of Radix and get to read it along with all the other excellent material in that magazine.
Yeah, I have this.
I mean, it's much better than the stuff on alt-right, isn't it? Let's just say that here now.
Oh, Colin, it originated at alt-right.
Just a lot of great bon mots and entertaining, even funny at times, but very scathing, and it's really incredible. I mean, in a way, it doesn't really matter who wrote it, but it's kind of incredible to think this was a black woman who's writing this very pro-white, very, very, very much this piece that's very much in favor of whites looking after their own interests and so forth. Just I even underlined a couple of things here. She's talking about how whites aren't allowed to have their own identity or aren't allowed to organize among themselves. And she writes, even if an organization is inadvertently all white, it must first be accused of loathsome racist motives so that it can be monitored. Yeah. She's observing, just the whole zeitgeist as far as race codes, pertaining to whites.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how benign the group's objectives, if white men are its creators, that it must be put under surveillance and ultimately neutralized. And then later she says, she writes, whites, it would seem, must not be left to their own devices. Before taking back the country, is it possible that they will first take back the right to organize among themselves?
Yeah.
That's pretty, like I said, pretty fiery and scathing. And in some ways it's sort of like, I mean, I guess it's interesting because it's sort of like somebody outside the group slapping this group around and saying, hey, come on, shape up. What are you guys doing?
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting to be if you look at it that way.
Yeah, I heard the anecdote that she told that to the CFCC, the Council of Conservative Citizens, which is a Southern group, quasi-racialist group, pretty much racialist group, and they, I think she told them, she was like, I'll never support you ever again unless you remain a white advocacy organization. So she was very interesting. I have this, I think I mentioned this to you guys before we went on air, but a friend of mine and I have also often joked that there's this, we have a kind of birther controversy with Elizabeth Wright, that she's actually some Italian writing to us from Berlin or something. Kind of it's almost just really unbelievable that she was a black lady. But I think it is quite true, and I won't go into all the details. I never met her personally myself, but I did correspond with her a number of times. But I have had it confirmed to me in ways that are trustworthy that she was in fact a black woman. Although she was a very reclusive woman. She was really what we like to call a shut-in, for lack of a better term. She would have some email correspondences with people. She would certainly write these great stuff. She wrote her Issues and Views blog and stuff like that. But she was really not someone who liked to pal around or really even have personal relations. She was a very private person. So again, I just think she was a kind of she's a kind of enigma, but then she's also just this really peculiar woman who maybe lived in her own mind a lot of the time, but a really fascinating woman. And also I should say this, I did have an email correspondence with her, and she was very, she's polite and warm, very, very nice person, but she definitely kept to herself. So, but yeah, I think also just to add on what you were saying is, I think it is true when you see these groups, and you can see this with even some, a terrible group like the Promise Keepers, which was actually this kind of all male club created by the former.
Yeah, she mentions them in the
article. She wrote some good pieces on them. That she seemed to come to the same conclusion about the Promise Keepers as did William Luther Pierce. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, she wrote some good pieces on them, and I think it is true that whenever you have a group that is men organizing as men, and not to mention they're all white, it doesn't even matter what they say. Yeah, I mean that's gonna push the I won't even call them liberals. It's gonna push all their buttons. They just don't want to see it. The idea of those
always
crowds,
other white men who start to notice it.
To a large extent, that's true. But it freaks out a lot of the establishment and the liberals. But I think the great irony to all this is that the Promise Keepers, if you look at them, I mean they were literally washing the feet of blacks. You can actually, Sam Francis wrote about this in the Southern Baptist Convention. They brought in blacks, were washing their feet, and all this foot washing kind of stuff. All this basically heretical Christianity, race religion. And so, and again, the Southern Baptist Convention, in the mind of the liberal, that's like the inner sanctum of reactionary conservatism, and yet at its inner sanctum, it's some egalitarian, pro-race mixing ideology. I mean, very odd. And Promise Keepers is the same way, and I believe his name is McCarthy or McCartney, who's the former coach who was running it. He was almost pro-black to a way that was shocking, supporting his daughter getting knocked up by all his black football players. I mean, it was really, really horrible stuff. And so it was all egalitarianism. And then you see Glenn Beck again. It's like the Tea Party did start out as a semi Ron Paul movement, and then it became a kind of angry reactionary movement. And then it ended. Yeah, and then it ends up you have icons of Martin Luther King, and Glenn Beck is telling you to go back to your church and your mosque and pray, that we can now become Americans again. I mean, it's just this gooey.
And what's the common factor?
Christianity? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Sounds like it to me. Yeah. Hate to say that, but yeah, that's what seems to be
and Mormons
from the
and Mormons.
Let's not forget them.
Yeah, but yeah, no. I think Colin is without question correct. I mean, all of these have a kind of, there's a certain kind of moral quality to them that people really think that what they are doing is good. It just makes them feel all gooey inside when they take part in these activities, and you can't get away from that. It's not like a group of white men getting together and saying, well, this is the kind of Jack Donovan style,
Yeah.
Hey, look.
Yeah, but it's just like, but having said it, there's this Christian element, and we could also say, why don't the Russian Orthodox Christians get like this? Right. Why didn't the kind of medieval Crusaders get like this? There's got to be something else as well.
Well, it's
I know. Well, that's what I'd bring up. Well, I guess when the anti-Christian rhetoric really gets ramped up, I sometimes bring up issues just like that. Where it didn't really take that turn until what, the 20th century, pretty much. Maybe the 19th century in some ways, I guess, with the abolitionists or the radical abolitionists and so forth. But
so is it basically Protestantism?
Maybe, or maybe it's when Christianity got in some ways dethroned when gosh, I'm not really, if I'd gotten prepared, I would have checked some sources and been come prepared. But I'm kind of just speaking off the cuff here. But just when Christianity, when there became this culture of doubt that started up, I guess, with the rationalists of the 18th century going into the 19th century, so the spirituality of it was removed, and yet people still had this, they're still ingrained with this Christian bent, where they felt the need for redemption, but it was seen in exclusively worldly terms.
So it's like a displacement. It's like a displacement of the sense of sin.
Yes.
But they couldn't feel bad about the things which the old Catholics felt bad about, so they kind of sucked in whatever was available.
Yeah, I mean, the primal sin, the original sin is racism or slavery or the Holocaust or whatever.
Right.
And but we are going to achieve transcendence by, in some ways, transcending our own biology and our own communities, transcending ourselves and our own instincts. And we're going to transcend that into some kind of heaven of pure equality and nonviolence or something. I mean, if I were to try to sum up the religion, that's it.
But it doesn't seem to. I mean, there are black Christians too, and there are, Christians of other races. It doesn't seem to have soaked into their consciousness. It's something that seems to have exclusively happened among whites in the West.
It's a faulty gene.
It's I don't know how to totally account for it, but it does seem like there's maybe the the influence of Christianity, the cultural influence of Christianity has something to do with it, but it also has something to do with just how white people tend to be. I don't know if I want to say biologically. That might be a loaded way of putting it, but I don't know. Again, I'm just speaking off the cuff here. But,
well, I think there's some very strong egalitarian tendencies in whites biology. I mean, I believe that, and I think a lot of those were actually good in a way. That there's certain kinds of teamwork and desire for fair play that built up cooperation and were really evolutionarily beneficial and maybe even evolutionarily necessary to survive the ice age.
Just look at the way we cooperate on air. It's great, isn't it?
It's true. This goes back. All these things are. Yeah, I mean, it's right. I mean, whites. The kind of smiliness you get from so many whites. I don't think it's just an American thing, because I lived in Germany. As well. The kind of smiliness, the customer service, the desire to please.
I think it comes out more in America because like in Europe, they've always had these various kinds of conflict. And in America, you haven't really had enough conflict. You haven't really had that enough historical process, and you haven't really had enough historical challenges.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I believe that. I just think it's different. I don't think it's not enough. I just think it's a very different thing. And I think this relates to religion in particular, and this also relates to what I was talking about in the last podcast. I think there's a very strong asymmetry between European Christianity and American Christianity, and I actually don't believe it has everything to do with the Catholic-Protestant divide. I think it's bigger than that. and that is that the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and also Protestant churches were really part of the hierarchy and the ruling order, so that aristocratic elites who were secular, they were a family, and so on and so forth, they were connected to the church, and there was a much stronger sense that the Catholic Church supports the aristocracy, the Calvinist House of Hohenzollern, and so on and so forth. Many examples. In the United States, you had a very different thing where a lot of people setting the tone, ideologically speaking, were dissenters. They were people who wanted to reach a kind of pure, more...
Yeah, so you're referring to the Founding Fathers, which in Elizabeth Wright's essay, she seems to take a kind of very positive view of, though.
True. I'm not actually just referring to the Founding Fathers. I'm also referring to a lot of the religious dissenters. The Founding Fathers, a lot of them were, in many ways, these free-thinking deists who also were, some of the wealthiest and greatest landowners in the whole country. They were a kind of elite class that probably has its own background.
Were they mainly Episcopalian?
Yes. And then also with people like John Adams, you had some Unitarians and things like that. But yeah, and it was kind of a little bit different. I think just in more, I'm kind of talking about in some ways the old time religion that survived. That was obviously something a little bit different, but also the Puritans and a number of. I just think there's a very strong, really authentic, organic kind of Christianity in America that is it's an American religion. It's much more biblical and it's much more, in a way, Hebraic. And it is not attached to a ruling elite. So it's very different than the
sounds
the
like low church or Puritanism.
Yeah, that's what it. That's yeah.
That's a part of it.
Yeah, that's a very strong part of it, and I think there's a real strong American flavor to this about getting away from it all, getting away from the corruption of old Europe, and and what they were trying to get away from was all the things that the three of us as traditionalists. We hope to be traditionalists, even though we watch football on Sunday. But
nobody's perfect,
right? But as traditionalists, the kind of things that we admire. I mean, I've always had this bug in me that I've always kind of felt. I don't want to say I felt more European. I always felt like I wanted to be in Europe. I always loved that history, that culture, that writing. Whether it was visiting England or visiting. I remember visiting Italy when I was young. All of those things. I'm sure if I had visited Russia or Germany later on, I spent a lot of time in Germany later on. I just had this sense of, that's what I wanted to be a part of. Just this, millennia old traditions, great churches, great heroes, statues of heroes and conquest, and, philosophers who philosophized on the highest possible levels. And, I don't know. I've just always had that bug in me. And I think in some ways, so much of the American religion has
sounds suspiciously like an inferiority complex.
Well, that might be true. I don't think so, but obviously you can't self-analyze. Freud taught us that, but I think it was much more positive than a inferiority complex. But that was definitely always my kind of view of the world. And I think in some ways American Christianity is just so antithetical to that. That was the corruption, like everything that I just described, and also kind of the Hebraic tendency. I think is also something can be very dangerous. Go ahead.
I was there probably, we've probably almost rambled almost about enough to please our listeners for one more podcast, but maybe next time or some other time. I mean, related to all of this, related to the Glenn Beck rally and all that. All the stuff discussed in Elizabeth Wright's article is, what we were talking about last time, how, Richard, you have this thesis that America was a doomed project from the start because it was founded on principles that were not valid. I'm simplifying it, what you're saying considerably, but that it was basically based on these liberal type of principles that are unsound. And yet today's conservatives, today's American right, can only wave the flag and shout USA, 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 which is something else in Elizabeth Wright's article she mentioned, and cheer for all these insane wars and so forth. And so it seems like that's something we could, maybe get into some other time. It's just this whole, I guess it's been crudely called the patriotards.
Yeah.
Among the rights, the people who can only, in some ways they're hearts and minds are in the right place, but they have this, somehow this block where anytime anyone mentions America bombing some hapless Middle Eastern country or whatever, then they just start waving the flag and say America, fuck yeah, that whole perspective on things. Among the right, that's something that really has to be dealt with. It seems like, because like you were talking about before, if you're right, if America was founded on principles that were ultimately not valid, in that it was founded on the idea of equality, when in truth, when the truth is hierarchical, among humanity.
I just think we shouldn't subscribe to that idea that America was founded on principle, and we should kind of relate it to Japanese politics. And we should say that America was founded on individual kind of self-interest, and that the principle kind of came later to sort of dress up the naked self-interest of the founding fathers.
Well, the French Revolution, which had some things in common with the American Revolution, and in many ways was different, but their watchwords were liberty and equality, right? I mean, liberty, equality, fraternity. Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, maybe it's both. I mean,
well, I think Colin is right. I mean, I believe that power comes first, and then you start to rationalize. But I don't. I mean, just to split a little bit of a hairs here, I don't believe that the Declaration of Independence that in itself was like the founding of America. That's in some ways to believe a kind of naive liberal version of history, where it's like all these good people got together and they decided that they wanted to finally declare equality and create a nation. It's kind of this almost like hippie project or something. I obviously don't subscribe to that. I think there were a lot of very structural things that were in place that led to this, and one of them,
like the Atlantic Ocean,
the Atlantic Ocean, and the fact that all these these religious dissenters were coming over here, that was a certain founding stock, and they kind of set the tone in terms of how you justify things. That's always been a very powerful
don't forget
strain.
the Scotch Irish as well.
Yes. So I think there's some real structural questions here. And I think the other thing is just the question of the idea of sovereignty and the ideal of sovereignty. It's in the United States, there's this kind of fantasy of because we want our eternal rights to be protected, we create governments. And I don't think any of us would think that describes how any government was ever created in the history of the world. And it's
like they're taking Hobbes and Rousseau too literally.
Yeah, that's clearly that was the only kind of political theory that they had in the kind of Lockean political theory. But I think in some ways it made more sense in the United States, in the sense that you had a lot of people who really were living in small groups and bands. They didn't really have this notion of the state in the way that Europeans did. I mean, I think if you were a Prussian, you recognize that your people could not survive without the state. They were in a very different geopolitical situation, surrounded by major forces on both sides. There's just a stronger sense of that kind of sovereignty. The sovereign can protect. It can be a guardian, protect the nation. And I think Americans actually had a kind of sense of equality, in the sense that you could just go out there, and if you could fend off Indians, you could make your way in the world. And I think this also led to a certain kind of libertarian streak, and so on and so forth, which again can be good in certain ways, and can be admirable, but I think it also has its really severe limitations. So I just think I don't think it's just all men are created equal. I don't want to be like a one cause historian, where it's like, oh, Jefferson wrote that and then all was lost. I think that was part of it. The fact that it was created, the state was created in the Age of Enlightenment, and therefore that's how it was justified. That's very important. But I think there are a number of different forces that are all different, but kind of seem to push the country in the same direction. And that is towards not having a strong sense of sovereignty, having a strange sense of sovereignty, and a different one than European, and also having this kind of biblical Christianity. And also
the interesting point is that some people have tried to impose that on other societies and countries. Like the very thing you're talking about is being imposed on Europe in various forms.
Yeah.
And we're seeing sort of the reaction against that with some of the articles we've published on alt-right.
Yeah. But there's no reaction against it in America. In America, the conservative reaction is more liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Is more liberal, did you say?
Yeah,
or more liberalism, a different strain
of liberalism, an earlier form. And I think it's even worse. To go back to Paul Gottfried, I'll put his book in the show notes too. What he talks about is that American conservatism was this free-floating, abstract values system. And the thing is about these values, so-called, is that so conservatism is not based on, say, a people or a race or a civilization or a state. It's based on eternal values, and these values are kind of like a cloud in the sky. You look up and it's there. And then it's over there, and then it's back there again. It's just free floating all over the place, and you can kind of see this, I think, with conservatives and Glenn Beck. I mean, Glenn Beck is basically asserting in 2010 what liberal historians were asserting in 1960. He's pathetically behind. The funny thing about conservatives is that, if you look at their perspective on the civil rights movement, it's like at one point they claimed that they opposed it, and then conservatives, not Republicans, conservatives opposed it, and then they kind of denied that they ever opposed it, and then by the early 21st century they claimed that they invented it. And I think this is, a friend of mine has mentioned this about gay marriage. Now they oppose it, and they come up with all these, quasi-mendacious, legal and natural law reasons. Just the fact that they think that men getting married is kind of gross. But anyway, they oppose it, and then 10 years from now they're going to probably deny that they ever opposed it. Like, we never opposed that. And then by 2040 they're going to be like, we invented gay marriage.
Yeah, but by then all gays will be kind of clamoring to abolish gay marriage, I should imagine.
Well, hopefully, because they want to move on to more bohemian, polymorphous forms. Well, guys, we better put a bookmark in it. We might ramble all night.
Too far, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, this podcast.
But I think that might be a good thing to talk about, or to focus on the whole. Again, the patriotard. I know that's it's a crass way of putting it, but that whole tendency, that whole bent in America, among the American right, that even persists into today when Obama's in charge and pretty much the whole government is run by left-wing Democrats. Still, it's like, America.
Yeah, we're the greatest thing ever. Well, they don't have anything else. There's no sense of history. There's no sense of your extended family, your millennial civilization. So all you have is we're the biggest economy and we really kick ass for these little countries.
And the thing, I always say, tell me it's the best country in the world.
Yeah.
That whole...
overt displays of power are always the surest sign of impotence.
Protesting too much.
Yeah,
I agree.
She protesteth too much. Yeah.
Right. Well, guys, we'll just put a bookmark in this one. We'll return to all these issues. This has been the longest, most rambling podcast, but I think it's also one of the more interesting ones.
From what they want.
Yeah.